We've configured QoS at the system level, but in order to extend that policy down to the servers, we're going to need to create a QoS policy that will be applied to the vNix. In this nugget, we're going to take a look at how exactly we do that in UCS Manager. The QoS system class enables these QoS settings throughout the entire system, but it does not help us get the actual policy down to the server. So we have gold and silver enabled and best effort, which is enabled by default. Fiber channel is its own thing, so we're not going to worry about that. But we have these three traffic classes. So how exactly do we go about applying those to the servers? And what we need to do is create a QoS policy. Now, to configure a QoS policy, we need to be on the LAN tab if we're not already there, and we scroll down in the tree to this policies section, and we find QoS policies, which by default there are none. So we can right click on this and say create a QoS policy. So as with most policies, we're going to give it a name, and we'll call this QoS-BE for best effort. We're going to configure our best effort QoS policy. And the way we do that is we select from the drop-down the traffic type. Now remember, we defined in the system QoS settings that best effort equals 0, which is the default. But we also said that silver is equal to a COS tag of 2. So UCS is going to use these tags in the infrastructure, but when we come to this drop-down, we see that we don't see what those COS values are. So it's very important that we understand what our own policies are in the data center. In this case, we're just going to pick best effort. So what about some of these other settings? Well, first of all, keep this in mind. The QoS policy is going to be applied to a vNIC. So when we have our hypervisor host, and the hypervisor host sees that we have a vSwitch, and we have two connections into this vSwitch, these connect into UCS vNICs right here. So any policy that we apply is going to go onto one of these vNICs. So when we're talking about the rate of a line, by default, most vNICs are 10 gig. We do have some 40 gig coming out. And so the question is, do we want to rate limit that? If we have maybe a backup job or something that could actually eat up a lot of network bandwidth, we might want to rate limit that and maybe down to 5 gig or something along those lines. So it's in kilobits per second. We can change that if we want. And then the burst is sort of the grace of a QoS rate limitation. So if we do rate limit a particular vNIC, then yeah, it's going to be restricted to, let's say, 5 gig, but we can actually burst up an extra 10K on a given moment. So it's not a whole lot compared to the 5 gig. We might want to consider increasing that if we do define a rate limit, but that's something to consider as far as limiting bandwidth in the data center. Last but not least is host control. So host control gives us two options, and it comes down to this. Do we trust the server that's downstream? So if we have that situation, again, we have the vSwitch connecting up to our vNICs up here, and let's say we get a packet that has a COS tag of 5, and we have these vNICs configured for a COS tag of 4. What's going to happen? So if host control is none, we're going to say we do not trust this host. So 5 will be scrapped, we will tag it with a 4, and we will pass it along. But if we do trust it, if we say, yeah, we want to give the host control over the COS tags, then if we get a packet that is unmarked, then we'll mark it with a 4 and we'll pass it upstream. But if we do get a packet that has its own tag, so maybe it is coming in with a COS tag of 5, then we're going to trust that and we're going to allow it upstream. The good news is, for the most part, we're not going to mess with these policies. What we really want to do is define a QoS policy for each one of our tags. So in this case, we're going to make a QoS policy for QoS-BE, and we'll say OK. And we'll create another one and say QoS-silver, and we'll pick that silver from the drop-down and say OK. And last but not least, we will create that gold policy, QoS-gold. Change this to gold, say OK. And now we have our QoS policies defined and ready to go for when we configure our vNICs. QoS policies allow us to extend our QoS tags down to the server vNICs. It also gives us some extra control over rate limiting and allowing the server to set its own COS tags. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.